Welcome back. Still tuned in to News and Views with myself, Silailo Makudi. Our time is 8:35 Central African Time, and it's time for hashtag Africa Focus feature. If you're new to the show, it's a part of the show where we look at some of the biggest stories on the African continent, what needs attention, what is of integral moment at this current juncture when it comes to the continent and everything that is happening in and around us. And as Africa currently is navigating, I think we can all agree, a rapidly shifting global order marked by geopolitical competition, economic uncertainty, and just a general growing pressure that comes from all sectors, whether it's climate and financial justice. It is very, very important to look at these issues in coordination. And all eyes this week we're on Nairobi, where African leaders have gathered for the Africa France Summit, which was hosted by Kenyan President Mr. William Ruto and also the French President Emmanuel Macron. The summit is being presented as a fresh chapter in relations between Africa and France, and it is focused on investment and the rise of artificial intelligence, climate finance, and strategic partnerships. Critics argue that we need a language of equal partnership, as in this whole case. There seems to be one that is benefiting more than the other. There seems to be one when it comes to this relationship between Africa and France in particular, because we know the footprint that they've had on the continent, colonial one, still looks very lopsided into France's favor. It is not of equal footing as we'd like it to be. And there's a deeper geopolitical calculation of France essentially seeking to rebuild influence on a continent where anti-French sentiment has grown sharply over the years, particularly when you look at West Africa. This following military withdrawals from countries like Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, what is known as the Coup Belt. It was a successful summit. It reflected, I think, largely on President Ruto's growing ambition to continue to position Nairobi as a diplomatic and economic gateway to Africa, replacing South Africa. That's the sentiment that us here in the South continent tend to think. It's also well to strengthen ties with Western powers like France amid domestic and political pressures that he has back at home. So we're going to be looking at that summit and everything around it and what it had to offer. Can we call it a success for Africa? Can we call it a success for the people of Kenya? Most importantly, and we're going to be doing that with none other than Africa analyst Kofifi Kouakou, who's joining us via our virtual platform, who's going to be analyzing it for us and giving us, I think, some insight on how you and I, as Africans, should be taking this summit. Should we take it with a pinch of salt? Should we celebrate it, having Africa position itself, hopefully, on an equal footing with everyone else on the globe? Kofifi, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to News and Views. Really appreciate you giving us your time.
Well, thanks very much, Salaelo. It's Kofi.
Kofi. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So sorry for that. I want us to jump right into it. Sure. Let's begin broadly. What would you say was the real significance of this year's Africa France Summit, especially being hosted in Nairobi, rather than the traditional Francophone African states as it was always the norm?
Well, I mean, the key thing to it, and thanks for having me again, the key thing here is it is very clear that the context and the core argument there for the French is that, I mean, I qualified as a desperate, strategic attempt to pivot away from Francophone Africa to Anglophone Africa, where they've been having problems, especially in Francophone Africa, West and Central Africa, where they've been having problems with their colonial and most important, neo-colonial postures that really keep maintaining most of these countries under development. I mean, they just can't figure out how to get out of the miseries they're in. And the key word here is trying to establish a new sovereignty and escape French colonial ways of doing things. But in the middle of that, most important, French is really going under what I call a strategic reset a strategic retreat and repositioning in Africa. And they can't reposition themselves back into the colonies, the old colonies, because most of those countries are saying, look, we don't want you anymore. And that starts with Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Chad, where they've been booted out. And for decades, France has relied heavily on its historical sphere of influence in those countries in West and Central Africa, what critics call France-Afrique. But, you know, the colonial and neo-colonial architecture are collapsing politically, militarily, psychologically. I mean, this is also important, the psychological part, and also symbolically. And I think one of the things that makes it so powerful is that African countries now have understood that, you know, they're just tired of this way of this relationship that's not equal enough. And then, of course, the world is changing fast. You can see that the youth in these places are saying, you know, we don't want to be under your thumbs anymore. Although there's a great deal of migration of young people towards Europe because these countries are dysfunctional. So let me summarize this. In short, Kenya has become now a central point to their strategy because it's on that eastern coast of Africa. It's also the East Africa seems to be working economically well, and is also, as you know, it's geopolitically compliant to what's happening strategically in the world. So President Macron's visit is not simply a bilateral visit. It reflects a deeper geopolitical transition underway in Africa. France is also, of course, adapting its collapse of its traditional influence in Francophone Africa. But also, more important, the larger story is this. Africa is no longer peripheral to world politics. Africa is now really central to the emerging multipolar world with the BRICS, with other things. And then so the battle of influence, as you know, with all the other countries, especially China, Russia, Middle East powers, even Turkey is involved in it. And then there's a lot of things that's not being covered, especially on Islam. The growth of Islam in Africa is having also an impact on what's going on.
Most definitely. I think you touched on a very, very important point. The fact that France in itself, the influence that it used to enjoy, particularly in West Africa, has declined, has dwindled quite dramatically in recent years. Just looking at the current state of affairs, France in itself as a country, do you think in this, shall we say, quote unquote, new scramble for Africa, as you mentioned, where you have so many other, you know, countries and regions that want to influence their presence and dominance on the African continent because of the shift in the global order. Is France still in the conversation? You know, when you look at countries like China emerging quite significantly, the BRICS bloc, as you mentioned, also emerging quite significantly, and you still have the United States of America, who have also this new hurrah that they also, you know, going into when it comes to Africa and the influence that it has. France, looking at them particularly internally, looking at the state of their affairs, how strong the economy is, are they still in the conversation when it comes to some of the most influential countries in the world, to a point where they can be in a conversation when it comes to them influencing what's happening on the continent and being part and parcel of Africa, as Emmanuel Macron said, that they are the biggest pan-Africanists?
My clear, straight answer to you is no. They're really struggling. I mean, one of the things they're struggling with, let's say the two components. The first component, which is a much larger picture, as you put it in your question, the global geopolitics. France is not seen as a big player. Of course, they used to be really important because of the colonial and neo-colonial influence in Africa, especially in what is called Francophone Africa, which is a very derogatory thing to say. This is our backyard. You know, we ruled this place for a century or two. We're still going to be there. There is a legacy of that colonial element and neo-colonial element. But at the larger picture, globally, France is not a big player. If you look at the big players, of course, the United States, China, very big ones. And then, of course, the most important one that really creating problems to France now is Russia. So France has got, President Macron has got what we call an African anxiety about Russia. And, so the visit in if you want, in Kenya, cannot be separated from France's broader confrontation with Russia, especially in West Africa. And it's a big one because President Macron sees Russia's rise in Africa as first, three elements. First, a direct existential challenge to France's influence. Second, a strategic humiliation. I mean, the fact that the French have lost their military presence in Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Chad, it's just huge slap on the face. They didn't take advantage of the colonial legacies to build those countries. And then the third one is that, it's part of also what I call a geopolitical threat to Europe itself, of which France is part of. But what is interesting to see is that Russia has successfully positioned itself in part of Africa as an anti-imperialist, anti-Western, sovereignty-driven. This one is a very important, sovereignty-driven, because if you listen to the military governments in Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and even Chad, they're talking most of the time about sovereignty. We want to rule our countries on our own. We don't want to depend too much on other nations outside, especially France. And then the other one that's very important that Russia's successfully managed to position itself to say, look, we are security orientated and driven. We're going to help you to really sort out your security issue, although it's not quite yet, because, I mean, you've seen last week, at least last month, the whole terrorist attack on Mali. So there's still some teething problems there. So whether one agrees or not, that narrative that I just mentioned about Russia has resonated strongly in the Sahel. And then, of course, the most important point is that President Macron's increasingly aggressive rhetoric towards Russia is partly driven by the fact that French is declining. France's global influence is declining. France has got domestic problems at home. And then, of course, the loss of Africa, the loss of prestige in Africa is a huge slap in this face.
Most definitely. I want to come back to the hosts here, Kenya, and in particular their president, President Ruto. He has increasingly, I think, positioned Kenya as almost a diplomatic hub for Africa of some sort. How much of this summit would you say is about Kenya elevating its own geopolitical status and sometimes going against the grain of what other African states would traditionally address some issues, whether globally or internally on the African continent?
Very important question. And I mean, the question, the other subsequent question is why Kenya and why President Ruto? Kenya for France represents three things. The first one is France sees or perceives Kenya as a stable diplomatic gateway, which means what? That Kenya is viewed, as you said already, as a relatively stable, globally connected, and then a potential geopolitical location and security partner in the Horn of Africa, not far away from what's happening now between Iran, Israel, and so forth, and the Middle East. But also a business-orientated place, because the East Africa is growing economically. But also the other one is that France perceives Kenya as a less burdened by French colonial memories. So that's a good entry. And and like Mali or Burkina Faso and Kenya, Kenya doesn't have a deep historical resentment towards France, although there is an element. The second point, most important, is that East Africa is economically strategic. It's a growth corridor. France sees East Africa as growth corridor. It's an Indian Ocean strategic zone. It's also a gateway for emerging markets. And of course, in the details, some of the things we don't know much here in Southern Africa is that Kenya over the years has grown not closer to Ethiopia as well as a tech hub. I'm sure you've heard about, what do they call it? It's something Valley, not Silicon Valley, but there's also a big tech hub, financial hub. And when we talk about financial hub, many of you remember M-Pesa that was developed in Kenya that took over financial, very important in tech financing, but also a logistical hub, very important. But of course, also seen as a diplomatic capital of East Africa. Remember, the United Nations has now moved. They've moved the part of the Africa area, big department in Nairobi, big one. So President Macron, when French position inside a digital infrastructure, this whole talk about green energy. You remember, I think it was last year, a couple of years ago, there was a big meetings there about green energy, ecological transition, AI, and even telecom. And the last one, the third one, is that President Ruto is increasingly positioned as a continental broker. And it's a really interesting position because if you remember a couple of years ago when President Ruto went to the White House, he was sitting in the chair of, and at the White House, he was moving around, showing himself. So President Ruto now is becoming highly visible internationally. Remember, there was also the Kenyan mission to Haiti, sending the police there to deal with, crime and then terrorism and so forth. The other one is climate diplomacy. Kenya is also playing a role there, same as peace mediation, multilateral engagement, and of course, Western diplomatic circle. And you know that next month, President Ruto has been selected to be the only African to attend the G7 summit. And because, as you know, so that, he's been sort of legitimized as a Western, quote unquote, a pawn, somebody's going to play a role away from somebody like President Ramaphosa, who
you can say it openly. He took our invite. He took President Ramaphosa's invite.
Exactly.
Ready to beat around the bush. That's what essentially happened.
Exactly. So they're now, the French, and they're now using, African leaders against each other, one or another, divided and rule. So they see, at least they're painting President Ruto as a pragmatic African leaders that could legitimize their sort of interest in Africa. And I think this is really a strategically important point to keep in mind. But Africans are very worried because it has implication. If Africa is seen as a divided place, it is a very difficult for Africans to play a very important role. But we know that the continent is now becoming more and more attracted by the large part of people. And France's strategy is to say, we want to influence Africa. Their new strategies in Africa is to want to influence without occupation, military occupation, but they're going on economic diplomacy, climate diplomacy. They're using things like AI partnership, infrastructure, startup ecosystem. They're about what? More than, I can't remember the number of French companies that are now there. So they are using all of that. They're using also cultural diplomacy. I'm sure you heard that the French are now returning, cultural artifacts back to Africa. But they also, one of the things they've done well over the years is to lock in what they call elite partnerships, which means they really prop up, specific leaders like Ruto, maybe other leaders in Benin, Patrice Talon and other people, and they keep them in their system. They have something called France Afrique, which is basically an elite club where they support each other. But most important, and in closing here for me, is that President Ruto is now seen as one of them. And of course, in the long run, they're going to drop him off like a brick.
Very, very concerning. Lastly, before I let you go, I was just looking at the summit's agenda, and it heavily focused on things like climate finance, I think artificial intelligence, entrepreneurship, and investment. Would you say these are genuinely Africa-driven priorities, or these are issues being shaped largely by European strategic interests? Is there a disconnect, at some point when you look at what's on the agenda and the reality on the ground when it comes to the African continent and the needs of the day when it comes to the rest of Africa?
Not at all. That's not an African agenda, although many of us would like to discuss these things. I mean, remember many years ago, the big talk was, 4IR, You remember that?
Yeah.
And
Yes.
and suddenly it's the fourth revolution, whatever it is called. It's now almost disappeared. Nobody talks about it. UJ's vice chancellor was a big one who left to go to be VCs now at University of Tokyo. It was all over this, but this thing has disappeared. So there's an agenda, and the French must be. Let's be clear here. When I'm sponsoring, I pay the piper. I decide the agenda, and
True.
some of the agendas that the Africans should be focusing on. It's basically seeing get rid of poverty, unemployment. And as you know, there was a last year, and then the year before, there were youth protests going into parliament, and young people in Kenya have had enough of the kind of leadership they have. And in fact, I was there a couple of months ago, and you could see that also things have come down. But youth unemployment is a big one. I forgot what it is, but it's beyond 50% or so. In any case, the agenda is not an African agenda. However, it's palatable enough. Most of these leaders love to see, we're talking about artificial intelligence, or maybe artificial intelligence going to help us solve poverty, but they don't have the electricity and the plumbing infrastructure necessary to power these new technologies. So these are very, very complicated issues to deal with, because after the conference, guess what? Everybody goes home. They've established maybe a few things that work, and then we're back again into the same mold. Our major, what I would call Afropocalypse: poverty, unemployment, inequality, corruption, and then, of course, most important, some of the things that really take us away from from developing, if you want, xenophobia and all this stuff. These are the element of agenda. But the most important, the Africa Vision 2060, moving around. If you know that, for example, it's difficult for Africans to move about the visa restrictions, but when Europeans come in, all of them just walk in without visas and stuff. So these are the issues Africans should be discussing. And then, of course, the bigger one is the role of the African Union, which is not, it's almost dysfunctional. And so to answer your question, it's not an African agenda.
Most definitely. Kofi, Kouakou, thank you so much for joining us. Or shall I say merci beaucoup, since we are the biggest Franco-Pan-Africanist in the world.
Okay.
Really appreciate you giving us your time. I really appreciate it. And I hope we chat again soon.
Merci beaucoup.
There we go. I think a really wonderful conversation there, looking at the French Africa Summit there, which happened this past week out in Nairobi. And Africa Analyst Kofi Kouakou there giving us insight on how we should be taking it as Africa, and just the disconnect in the agenda when you look at the African continent and what was on the agenda on that summit. I mean, you're talking about 4IR, you're talking about artificial intelligence and all of these big words on the African continent. Well, there's such a big disconnect. You can't talk about artificial intelligence when there are Africans to this day, some in Kenya where the summit was hosted, that don't even have lights. So climate justice and climate change, Africa is not even top 5 or top 3 biggest polluters in the world. But you want that to be on the agenda. You want to tell Africans to cut down on the coal and on the use of their resources like coal, like natural gas, and all of the non-renewables that we have. It's a shame, man. Honestly, need to take us serious, especially the leaders of the African continent that attended this thing. Going to take a quick break. This has been #AfricaFocus on News and Views. We'll be back with you after this.